This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and in this episode 885 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by Underdog Fantasy. Hey, thanks for tuning in. There are tons of best ball drafts happening over on Underdog of all entry prices and sizes. You really can find a league and contest that's right for you. Some of you haven't tried best ball out yet over on Underdog, so I've got something to offer you. If you've never signed up over there, head to UnderdogFantasy.com or download the Underdog app. Sign up, make a deposit with promo code LATEROUND, and when you do, you'll get a deposit offer. But you'll also get a free late round draft guide, which is the thing that I put the most effort into each and every year. That draft guide is in pre-order mode right now, which you can check out over on lateround.com. But if you'd rather not purchase it, you can get it for absolutely free by signing up on Underdog with promo code LATEROUND and making a deposit. And you get that deposit offer too. So again, UnderdogFantasy.com or download the Underdog app. Use promo code LATEROUND when you sign up. And that's all one word, Late Round. It's a mailbag episode though. Let's get to it. This first question is from Twitter. It's from @AyushMatal23. It says, with the Colts drafting A.D. Mitchell, is there a chance Josh Downs goes down the Elijah Moore path and gets pigeonholed as a slot receiver with minimal fantasy value? Got burned by Moore. Can we identify these types of wide receivers ahead of time? So I think there are some pretty big differences between Elijah Moore and Josh Downs. Obviously, neither player is very big, so there are some similarities there. And they both had really good collegiate production profiles too. But the reason myself and others were so bullish on Moore after his rookie season is because he wasn't a slot receiver. That's what's so infuriating about the Elijah Moore story. We thought that he would be a slot, but he only ran 29% of his routes from the slot as a rookie. And all of his peripheral numbers, his per route run numbers, his target share, even his fantasy points per game, they were all really strong. I think the story of Elijah Moore has just as much to do with off the field stuff as on the field stuff. That's just my honest take. Missing on him after year one, you're going to hit on those types of peripherals quite often. It just didn't work out with Elijah Moore. Sometimes that's going to happen. But that's a key difference between Moore and Downs. Moore wasn't just a slot guy. He played everywhere in year one. Downs was basically a slot receiver last year. He ran 81% of his routes from the slot. But fantasy gamers aren't valuing him the way they valued Elijah Moore after his rookie season. That can't be ignored. According to Dynasty League Football's ADP, Moore was wide receiver 24 in May after his rookie season. Right now, today, Josh Downs is wide receiver 53. The cost to acquire and invest in Downs is totally different. From a projection standpoint, it's tough to get there with Josh Downs. There's no doubt. We're talking about probably a middle-of-the-road passing offense at best in terms of volume. And he's got competition in that offense. The way they've built the wide receiver room, Downs probably won't be out there in two wide receiver sets. And there's a chance that A.D. Mitchell hits. And then all of a sudden, Downs becomes easily the number 3 target getter on that team. But my philosophy with situations like this, when prices aren't substantial for a player, I want talent on my fantasy rosters. I think Josh Downs is a very good slot receiver. He was a good prospect. He had a good first year in the league. Rather than getting worked up about situation, I'll follow the talent when the price point is as low as it is for Josh Downs. So I don't really think this is a similar situation as Elijah Moore. Moore hasn't even been a slot guy throughout his entire career, like beyond year one. He's played everywhere. Downs is more limited at the moment, but the price reflects that. This next question is from Patreon. It's from Robert. It says, using the 2 most recent podcasts tying Zap and year 2 model scores to redraft, are there any players you are more in or more out now? Yeah, so on that show, I talked about Chase Brown. That's because I just think year 2 running backs in general are good bets across the board, similar to rookie running backs. Now, I sent a newsletter blast out about those running backs, where I highlighted the top 24 running backs who had poorer prospect scores. That newsletter is for free. Go to lateround.com, sign up, just give me your email address. That's all you got to do. And you'll get that content. Remember what that running back study said. which you can find in the late round podcast feed. But what that study said was that top 24 running backs with prospect scores below 80, they only exceed ADP expectation at a 26.7% rate. The norm is around 50%. Meanwhile, they've exceeded ADP expectation by 3 or more points at just a 3% rate. Just one of the 30 running backs drafted in the top 24 at the position since 2014, who had a prospect score below 80, was able to give fantasy managers a big season versus ADP expectation. The running backs who are below that 80 mark this year while being drafted in the top 24, this is by underdog ADP, include Kyren Williams, Isaiah Pacheco, James Cook, Ramondre Stevenson, and Zamir White. I think Stevenson and White are going to end up being players to avoid for me this year. I actually do like Pacheco. I talked about him with Hayden Winks the other day. Meanwhile, Kyren Williams is definitely going to be a scary player to add to your roster if he's a firm second-round pick in home leagues. That's based on this study and his poor prospect score, but also Blake Corum. And then James Cook. I know it seems weird that his prospect score was below 80, and it was just below 80 for the record. But the ZAP model, my updated model, it didn't really love him. He's undersized, and he was in a split backfield in college, so his production profile didn't look that good. I also don't think it's that crazy to think that James Cook might end up being a little bit overvalued this year when you consider what Josh Allen does on the ground and what Ray Davis might be able to do in the RB2 role. Would it shock anyone if James Cook is not some massive league winner? If maybe he just matches ADP expectation? So those are the running backs to think twice about. Now at wide receiver, I'm higher on Zay Flowers for sure. Players who have his type of year 2 score, who go in his wide receiver range, they've seen great results in the past. And then the other guy that I mentioned on the show, Jackson Smith-Njigba. I think JSN makes a lot of sense as sort of a post-type sleeper. Those are the key players who I think those studies really called out. This next question is also from Patreon. It says, is it reasonable to predict a third-year breakout for Jalen Tolbert? Dallas didn't do much to improve the wide receiver room, and his only competition to be second on the depth chart is Brandon Cooks, who will be 31 in September. Curious what your thoughts are on how Tolbert profiles for the year ahead and in Dynasty. Thanks. I think the chance that Jalen Tolbert truly breaks out, and I mean becomes like a weekly starter in your fantasy lineup, I think that chance is very slim based on what we've seen historically. You can do this for basically any metric. But let's just look at target share. Tolbert has seen target share per game rates to start his career of 1.3% and 6%. He's seen 39 targets in 2 seasons. Since 2011, there have been over 100 unique wide receivers, individual wide receivers, who played 8 or more games in a season and scored 10 or more PPR points per game during any season after year 2. So we're not looking at rookies and second-year players, because Jalen Tolbert is no longer a rookie or a second-year player. These receivers only include guys who were drafted in 2011 or later, too. So these guys were drafted after 2010. They're in their 3rd NFL season or later. They played 8 games, and they scored 10 or more PPR points per game. Now keep in mind, 10 PPR points per game is not that high of a bar. It's not overly difficult for a wide receiver to hit that mark. And we have over 100 who got there. Of those 100 individual wide receivers, guess how many had target shares below 6% in each of their first 2 seasons? 4 of them. Those 4 are Noah Brown, Adam Thielen, Terrell Pryor, and Kamar Aiken. Remember Kamar Aiken? Talk about a remember some guys moment. Kamar Aiken. Terrell Pryor is only on that list because he wasn't even playing wide receiver during the first 2 seasons of his career. So you're looking at a less than 1% chance that Jalen Tolbert becomes anything substantial. And with Adam Thielen being the outlier here, he was an undrafted player who needed to climb his depth chart. Jalen Tolbert was a day 2 pick. It's not really an apples to apples comparison. Now here's another way to look at it. My prospect model database dates back to 2011. It includes every wide receiver who's either drafted or at the NFL Combine from 2011 until now. During that time frame, 470 plus wide receivers failed to score 5 PPR points per game in both year 1 and year 2. That number is so high because so many undrafted players or late round players, they don't do a whole lot in the NFL. Guess how many with a minimum 8 games played in year 3 scored 10 or more PPR points per game? 2 of them, Willie Snead and Isaiah Hodgins. They weren't exactly huge hits. I think if you're looking at Tolbert in a best ball stack, that's fine. Go for it. I'm sure he'll have some usable weeks. But history is absolutely not on his side to be some big league winning player, or even close to that. That's especially true when you factor in his draft capital. Because Jalen Tolbert has had opportunity. You have to ask yourself why he hasn't taken advantage of that. This next question is an email. It says, "Hey JJ, your prospect guide has been super helpful during rookie draft season, and I can't wait to read the upcoming draft guide. Thank you. My question is related to redraft. In most home leagues I play in, single quarterback leagues, QBs tend to go way ahead of ADP. Like sometimes 2 or 3 quarterbacks get drafted in the first round. As a result, I usually get forced into streaming quarterback. What do you think is a good strategy here? Is there ever a time where you'd reach to get a quarterback just so you have someone that you can trust, or do you hope for the CJ Strouds and Joe Flacco's to carry you through the season? Thanks, Tyler." So the answer here is it depends, as usual. But I get questions like this pretty often. And even the next question on today's episode is loosely related to this. You can't ignore what the market is doing in your individual league. You have the overall market, which is ADP, and how things generally go down. But then you have your individual league's market. And if your league is going to value quarterbacks the way they're valuing them, you can't just ignore the position. You have to pay attention to that. Now, with that being said, the question I'd ask you is, how much are they actually valuing these quarterbacks? Having a couple of teams in your league take a quarterback in the first round could actually be a huge benefit to you. Because when they take a quarterback, they're taking a devalued pick. They're letting better players fall to you. Where things get a little bit shakier is when teams are picking up multiple quarterbacks, which would dry up the waiver wire. Like if your best option to start next year is Bo Nix, then you have to think about spending up a little bit at quarterback. Your league is not just going to follow ADP. In situations like that, though, instead of overpaying for a higher-end quarterback, or inevitably overpaying for a mid-range pocket passer, which we never want to do, I'd rather just burn a roster spot on a backup quarterback and platoon the position to start the year. Get 2 QB2s and obviously hope that one can emerge as a QB1. But at the very least, have 2 guys you can play a little bit by matchup and hope to get a QB1 production from them. I'll be honest though, it's tough to answer these types of questions when we're only getting part of the story. How big is this league? How many roster spots do you have? It's important to know when top quarterbacks are falling off draft boards, yes. But what about the QB7, the QB12, the QB14? If those players are still in line with ADP, then all that means that you won't have an elite quarterback on your team, which is fine considering the opportunity cost. Because those elite quarterbacks in your league are going in round 1. But if the rest of the quarterbacks are going where they generally go, that's fine. You can get those other quarterbacks. But if those guys are also going super early, at some point, you have to adjust a little bit. You have to use your tiers because your individual league's market matters. The last question this week is from Twitter's from @NoMeetinTeam. It says, with the 3-2 wide receiver to running back starting ratio on Underdog, shouldn't the value wide receivers be a 1.5x to the running backs? For example, the RB12 should be going around the same point in the draft as the wide receiver 18. I consistently see wide receivers going way past 2x. Higgins, the wide receiver 27, going around Jacobs, the RB11. Has 0 RB gone too far? Now look, I'm currently becoming a best ball bro. So maybe a current best ball bro will have a better answer than what I'm about to say. But this is also a question about supply and demand in fantasy football. That's something I've talked about and studied for the last 13 years of my life. It's good to be thinking about roster requirements because that drives positional value more than scoring does. Like when people say they're going to go super early tight end because it's a tight end premium league, that's fine, but leagues where you're required to start 2 tight ends instead of 1, that's where tight end value starts to soar. That's where elite tight ends become a lot more valuable. Not because they're getting a little bit more points per reception. So it's good to be thinking this way. Where I think you're not totally thinking about this correctly, well, there's 2 spots. Number 1, it's not exactly a 1.5x ratio or a 3-2 ratio like you're describing because there's a flex spot too. If hypothetically wide receivers would always win the flex, then it would be a 4-2 ratio, not a 3-2 one. Next, you're making some assumptions about the types of players that you're drafting here. And this is something that I really focus on in the late round draft guide. You're saying that the RB12 should be the equivalent of the wide receiver 18 in this example. But what if the RB12 isn't projected to be a whole lot different than like the RB28? Why reach for that player? Why force the issue? In my research, I found that you'll have better success in the early rounds, generally speaking, with wide receiver. In the middle rounds, with running back. It's why I've preached an anchor running back strategy for years. Once you start getting into that RB2 range, the players you're getting just aren't that much different from a ceiling perspective than a lot of RB3s and even RB4s. The drop-off is a lot more gradual at wide receiver. But I think what's arguably more important here, if the market is being illogical in your eyes, you can't simply ignore the market, like I was saying with the last question. Like, you can't just ignore the fact that everyone's going wide receiver heavy, because they go wide receiver heavy throughout the entire draft. Best ball teams almost always consist of more wide receivers than running backs. So if you say to yourself, wow, the market is backwards here, and go with a bunch of early round running backs, you're going to fall behind dramatically a wide receiver. Just listen to what Hayden Wings said on Becoming a Best Ball Bro earlier this week. When you don't have 4 wide receivers through the first 7 rounds, that's been a problem historically. Now, I could get into a lot more detail than this, but those are the main reasons as to why things aren't as clean as you're making them out to be. It's good to have that supply and demand mindset, but it shouldn't really be used as a multiplier. Understanding where positions generally hit, where they bust, and how they score points, that's just as important. If you do want more detail about this kind of thing, you can definitely check out the draft guide. I go over this kind of thing every single year in it. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you had subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter, @LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening this week, everyone. Greatly appreciated as always. Enjoy your weekend, and I'll talk to you next week.